Hi, Cathal. Thanks for joining us. We're gonna just can we start by maybe you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your kind of earliest memories of hearing about HIV and AIDS in general, and kind of in Ireland particularly.
Yes, thanks, Hannah. I was born in Cork, and in 1974, 75, I was 19, 20, and I actually came out at that stage, and we founded a Cork branch of IGRM. By 1980, I was lucky enough to be elected president of UCC Students' Union, and we were involved in some activism then, and everything was very positive and joyous. And in fact, as president of the Students' Union and with Dennis O'Donoghue, who was the vice president who was responsible for welfare, we produced a welfare booklet. And he said, well, you probably want to write the homosexual section. So I wrote the homosexual beginning. Homosexuality doesn't do you any harm, and it can be lots of fun. So that was the atmosphere. We were sort of like changing the world. And then in 1981, July 1981, I moved to Dublin, and I lived in Dublin throughout the 80s. So the first sign of AIDS was actually in a publication we read as kind of radical gays called Body Politic, produced in Canada, excellent gay newspaper. And it started reporting these reports from America, New York, about this strange disease and saying we have to keep an eye on this. But nobody was too worried at the time. It was only sort of 5 or 10 people, gay men were affected, but you know, they were saying we're keeping an eye on it. And then by 1982, it had caught on, I think had developed up, it had begun exponentially. And we have that experience with COVID, how fast things can go. So suddenly instead of 10 gay men in New York, it was sort of like 250. And suddenly some of these people were very ill, so it was very worrying. And it was then that we heard that, you know, okay, we need to maybe look at the cause could be sex. And we made to look at that, this could be a danger. And we didn't know very much, but the people there in New York were working on it, and the political activists. So there was one political activist, he wrote a short pamphlet called How to Have, he was a scientist, and he wrote, a medical scientist, he wrote How to Have Sex in a Pandemic. And in that, he basically started the whole development of safer sex. And that was republished in full in lots of gay magazines, but in Body Politic. And that's how I came across that with my lover at the time, Martine. I was living together in Dublin. And with other people, we were involved in sort of gay politics in Dublin. So with Christopher Robson and Bill Foley, with Declan Doyle, etc., and other people. And so we were talking about this, and like, have you heard it? Is anybody involved, etc.? So we didn't really have any direct knowledge, but then it started to spread to London. So then it came a bit closer, and people knew Irish people in London. So someone would say, oh, I know somebody I think who has it. But of course, people weren't going around wearing a badge saying, I have AIDS or I have HIV. Now, these had different names at the time, initially, grade and HTLV3, etc. So all these because it was also new and developing, the names kept changing from the medical side. But what we know is HIV, people, you could have HIV obviously and not, a bit like COVID, you could have HIV and nobody would know. So people were keeping very silent, and there was this kind of spread of fear that this was associated with not nice people, male homosexuals, heroin addicts, and Haitians in America, and the hemophiliacs, and I'll come back to that. So that was the situation. And then in 1983, the summer of 1983, I went on a J1 visa to America, and I was in San Francisco for Gay Pride, which was phenomenal, life-changing for me, because first time I was in the crowd of like 200,000, 250,000 LGBTQIA plus people, and it was tremendous. It was a big festival. And what was interesting is that there was an AIDS information stall, but it was kind of discreet. It wasn't huge with what we would now see as the center of a pride thing. It was over at the side. I went and got some information, but the whole emphasis was like, we're partying Nobody wants to be a party pooper, as the Americans say. And so it was still kind of, even though I was in America and in San Francisco, which would be one of the cores of it, it still was on the edge of people's knowledge of daily practice. You know what I mean? I was aware I should be cautious. And the people I met, the guys I met in San Francisco would say we need to be cautious. And we kind of follow the guidelines of how to have sex in a pandemic kind of thing, safer sex. And then I suppose when the development of it was that I got a job in 1985 as a group librarian for AIB, the bank in Dublin and Ballsbridge at the time. And part of my contract was I got to go to London once a year to liaise with the colleague in London. So I had a holiday in London every year. And in 1986, when I was over there, I actually went to a play called The Normal Heart, which was about the setting up of gay men's health crisis. And by this stage, of course, I was involved in AIDS activism, etc. And so that sort of deepened my knowledge of it, made it more a human thing, but also brought some of the politics in it. And then in the following year, I went to a play called As Is, which was an interesting gay play as well, dramatizing what it was like to be a gay man in an AIDS pandemic. So those are well worth seeking out. The Normal Heart has been filmed. My memory of the Irish cases, it was late. I mean, we'll come back to it in a minute. We started AIDS activism before we even knew people had AIDS in Ireland. And it was 1986 before I first began to hear of people who were HIV affected and then didn't go on to have AIDS until 88, 89, etc. Some of them, and some of them died, some managed to live on, thank goodness. So that was my experience. I don't know if that answers fully.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I just wanted to ask you, Cathal, I know that you were very active in the LGBT rights movement before HIV, as you indicated there. And then particularly in Cork, you were one of the founders of the Gay Health Action Group. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about Gay Health Action, what they did and how that was formed at the time.
Okay. So in fact, I was in Dublin when we founded Gay Health Action, because we founded Gay Health Action in 1985. So 81, 82, the first signs of AIDS internationally. 83, it's in London, and it's coming closer. We're hearing from people. 84, what happens is, we're all involved in a range of gay activism, where we were involved in things like there was a murder of a gay man who worked in RT called Charles Self, and there was a big police harassment of the community. So we, as activists, were involved in protesting that. The following year, many of your viewers may have heard of the Fairview March and Declan Flynn. That happened, and we were all involved in organizing that march in 1983. As I say, I went off in the summer to America, then came back, was working in AIB, and in 1984, we were involved in a range of political activities. And then something happened in America. Rock Hudson, who would be like the Brad Pitt of today, if you think of Brad Pitt. Rock Hudson was an older film star, very, very big, close friends with people like Elizabeth Taylor. And he had a very macho image. You know, he'd be seen with girlfriends at times, but he never married. And we all in the community knew he was a closeted gay actor. And then suddenly in the middle of 1984, newspapers started saying Rock Hudson has AIDS. And initially they denied it, and then photographs appeared of him gaunt. You couldn't deny it anymore. You could see the man was dying. What that led to in Britain with the tabloid press, they started this huge, virulent, what we would now call trolling, vicious thing. Look, this proves it. Gay men are diseased. They shouldn't be allowed to be practicing. They kill each other and they'll kill us. What about those gay men in the closet? Will they kill their wives by bringing this disease back from their dirty clubs and saunas where they're getting up to all this unsafe, unhygienic, unhealthy, deadly disease? So they did much more. You'd have to look it up. I'm not even repeating the worst of it. You know, it was really vicious. And as I say, I'm from Cork, so like a good Cork man, you never really fully leave Cork. So I was in Dublin. I would go down to Cork once every 3 months or so, and I'd meet up with people down there, Donald Sheehan, Kieran Rose, etc., and Arthur Leahy. And I had lunch when I was down there one weekend in the summer of '84, and Arthur Leahy and I were talking, and he said, this is what's going on in England is awful. What's happening to the gay community there? You know, they have Thatcher with Section 28 coming down the line and a whole range of stuff, police harassment, and now they've got this. And he said, you know, we're this close. Ireland and Britain are this close. You know, what's happening over there today will spread here tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And so he said, we need to be ready as a community. They're going to come for us. And so we were involved, he was involved in a thing called the Gay Men's Collective in Cork. And we had founded a Dublin Lesbian and Gay Men's Collective. There was a separate lesbian collective in Cork as well. And we had a joint meeting. So I came back from Cork with this, and at the next meeting, I told what I'd been saying to Arthur, what he was saying. And then Arthur contacted later on and said, so brought it to the meeting in Cork. And then the Cork meeting sent a message to Dublin saying, we think we should found an organisation. And obviously you guys are in Dublin where everybody, you know, where the main focus is. So why don't you get moving? And we did. And contacted the other organisations. And a meeting was called for January 1985. Mm. And that's when Gay Health Action was founded. And it was founded there with the support of all the organisations. And we, one of the other things I should mention maybe is as well that there was a personal thing for me. A personal friend of mine, Pat McCarthy, he was a clothing designer and had a company, and they were exporting to New York, and he had business in New York. So he was back and forward from New York. So that autumn as well, he had sort of come back from New York, and he said, oh my God, it's dreadful. It's like Death Valley there, you know, things, and people are so scared. He said, you know, you people, you guys who are, you know, taking the leadership in gay activism in Ireland, you need to take a move now to start preparing for this, because you may not see it, but it's out there and it's coming for us, and it's going to be banned. So those were the motivations, and it started then in January 1985 as prompted by the gay collectives, but with everybody's support.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So just looking at, obviously we're talking today because of the quilts, specifically the AIDS Memorial quilts. And I wonder if you can tell us what your earliest memory of the Irish Names quilts or the AIDS Memorial quilts are.
Well, the earliest memory would be again Arthur in Cork, because my memory is I was back in Cork again in 1990. I was feeling fairly burnt out, and Gay Health Action had been going for 5 years, and there was a Gay Health Action group in Cork as well. And we were feeling very exhausted, etc. And Arthur, I remember Arthur saying, we need to raise awareness about this. We need to raise political awareness, but we need to reach out to people. We need to humanize this issue. And the quilts had already begun. People were doing quilts because they'd begun in America in '87. And some people in Ireland were already doing quilts. And so he said, what we need to do is initiate a tour of the quilts to bring them to, and to get political support from the broad range of political views here, to get publicity, because thankfully the Irish media wasn't as bad as the English tabloids and was much more receptive and much less virulent. So in fact, we had lots of friends. We found we had lots of friends in the media when we needed to sort of get the message out with Gay Health Action and about AIDS. And so he said, well, Quilt will humanize this and will help us to turn people's views that this is the sons of the sons, the nephews, the fathers, the brothers, of their neighbors, their family, or people just down the next road. And that's how my memory of it is, that it began then in 1980, and then the Quilt Tour took place itself in 1981. And so that's my memory of it. Now, maybe other people were thinking along the same lines as well. You know, Mary Shannon was obviously involved in the community work, etc. I didn't know her. So, but that's my memory. That's how I came to it.
Mm. And Cathal, you mentioned the tour. Do you remember kind of much about the tour that went on in Ireland, and also then when the quilts went over to the US?
Sorry about that.
No.
To take that again. Sorry. Okay.
No, yeah. So, no, you mentioned about the quilts going on tour, and do you remember much about when they were on tour in Ireland, but also when they went over to the US?
Yes, I do. It was, as I mentioned, we were feeling very burnt out after 5 years of Gaelic Action in Dublin, and you know, and I have to take responsibility. I was the person who said, "Listen, I have to step back. I can't keep going with this." And I was also going through changes. It was affecting my life, but I was burnt out of my life as well, needed changes. So we decided that to actually. I'm really sorry about this. I took notification, but silence this properly. Will I start that again?
Yeah.
Okay.
You just want to take it from when you were burnt out, maybe, because they'll be able to.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was burnt out, and I proposed that Gaelic Action in Dublin, we should cease to operate and hand over to AIDS Action Alliance, etc., who were getting traction and getting responses from the government, which they'd never given us. So we took a vote and we decided to do that. So we stepped down. I also resigned from my job. I felt very much that I was coming up to 40, and I felt exhausted and didn't know what I was doing. So I was on unemployment benefit, and I went to when the tour opened in the Mansion House, I went to it. And then I went down to Cork when it was on in Cork, because that's where I came from, obviously, and had a lot of resonance. So I went down there, and I went to it was held in City Hall. And this again was part of the promotion, and the part of the effect of the Quilt Tour was that these would not be held in out of the way side streets, in small galleries, which would be very sympathetic, that they should be held in public spaces that would give us. So in Dublin, it was the Mansion House. So we got the support of the politicians, local politicians, to put it in the Mansion House, which is the People's Building in Dublin. Likewise in Cork City Hall, a very significant building. And I went there, and I went with my mother, and she was supportive and very good. I don't know if you can see this photograph here. Sorry.
Oh, lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's me, obviously, on the left. And Onya Casey, a friend of mine, but she was involved with the Key Co-op in Cork with Arthur, and she got involved. So there were not just lesbians and gay men, and the lesbians were involved as well, obviously, and fully supported. But there were lots of supporters and allies from across who did it. And so we were there, and there was the sweatshirt, of course, which is there was also with the quilt was a fundraising activity. So there were lots of things. So there was, you can see on my jacket here, just the quilt badge. I don't know if you can see it very well. It's only very slight, but and then there was the quilt sweatshirt, which of course I bought, and it was laid out, and it was done. The quilt project itself, as many of your listeners may already know, but if you don't, the quilts are like graves. They're the same size, 9 by 3, I think, a foot by 3. So they're actually replicating a grave. And the American Quilts Names Project drew up guidelines, and the guidelines are very much that the quilt should be treated like the flag on the coffin of a soldier who's died, or a hero, or a public figure, or someone, that flag has to be folded in a certain way, has to be treated with respect. And those rules applied. So that created a sort of what I call gravitas, a kind of seriousness, that this was not just something, this was not just an artwork, this was something more, this was people's lives. And it was laid out, when I think of it as, it's like a graveyard. So when you go on a quilt tour, it was laid out more familiar nowadays, maybe it's more practical to put them on the walls, but they were laid out on the floor. So they're laid out on the floor like in a graveyard, and you passages between them, so you'd walk around between. You wouldn't walk on the quilts themselves. And in the halls themselves, the people organizing it would create an atmosphere that was sort of quiet, kind of, dare I say, kind of funeral home music, that ambient music that was calming, but also serious, and not loud. And you would have some incense, joss sticks maybe, or candles as well, so as to create an atmosphere that this was giving respect to the dead. and this was as if they were there. So this was a kind of virtual graveyard.
Mhm.
And it was beautifully done and very moving. Many people would end up crying, including myself. And then when I was in Cork, and because I was now not working, Arthur said, well, why don't you come along with us on the rest of the tour?
Mhm.
So I did. I went to Limerick with them and helped. I didn't do anything. I hadn't been involved in organizing it. I didn't do anything big in helping. I just did the fetch, go carry, catch, bring coffee, help the people who were doing the main organizing, and went with Arthur and the others and Donald to Limerick, and then on to Galway, then to Belfast, and then back to Dublin. So it was for me a kind of pilgrimage. It came at a very delicate time in my life when I was falling apart.
Mm.
And it allowed me, in a way, it made me cry over AIDS. Whereas before that, I'd been very much a tough political, we will fight, we will struggle. And you can forget that, of course, you need to be human as well. And you need to be, that there's a lot of feeling.
Mm. That's just, it's very powerful to hear that, and to hear the impact of that to you at that time when it was very real and very present. So I was just wondering, what do you think the importance of the quilts are now after all this time and as time passes?
Well, I think they're very important because, Kieran Rose years ago once outlined to me a theory of connectivity. He said, there is horizontal connectivity, which is what we're used to. You're born into a family, you're born into a country, you're born into a neighborhood, you go to a school, you make friends there. But then there's horizontal connectivity. And that is because this was before virtual thing and mobile phones and internet, etc. This back in the 80s. So it was virtual thing. These would be the people you would share things in common with that you wouldn't necessarily have with people immediately around you. So if you're gay, you could actually find, so like we ended up meeting Rodney Coombs, for instance, who was an activist like us in Tasmania, in Australia, fighting same British laws for reform, etc., and fighting AIDS out there. And you'd find that we had a lot more in common together, even though we were thousands of miles apart, than we would with maybe people just down the street. So that, I see this as a kind of, if you might, a virtual graveyard before virtuality happened. Today we have virtual, and we have like we have now, we'd have screens and we'd have people connecting in. But this, before we had that, the quilt was doing that before it was possible in electronic terms. It did it in physical terms. It brought these, and that's why it's so important today. It's a virtual graveyard, and it has huge resonance. For instance, one of the things I think is that you must remember is that it was very important politically. In America, as I mentioned, AIDS was stigmatized. Not always stigmatized, but there was, some of your viewers will have experienced Donald Trump. There was a kind of forerunner of Donald Trump called Ronald Reagan, who was very right-wing. He never used the word homosexual, and he never talked about AIDS. He was president during all this time. So if you can imagine Joe Biden now talking about COVID, but if you imagine back then, the president of the United States, there were, at that stage, by 1985, 86, there were thousands of Americans dying from AIDS, HIV AIDS. And he never mentioned it. He never spoke about it. Now, his health secretary had to, but he never did it. So there was that thing. Now, switch forward to 1996, when Bill Clinton was president, a very different president, very close to the LGBTQIA community. And the quilt has an anniversary. So they have on the mall, as they call it, Washington Mall, which is a big open air space, and it's huge. Where I was there, when I was there in '83, I went on a demo from San Francisco there, back to Contras, Nicaragua, and it was, it's a big, huge space. And they placed, by that stage, the American quilt, the full American quilt they brought there, was tens of thousands in 1996, tens of thousands. They placed it out, like I said, on the ground. And if you Google it online, Clinton's visit the quilt, in 1996, they came out, Hillary and Bill Clinton, I'm sorry, getting emotional suddenly, because it was just such a significant moment for American gay men, politics and gay life, but internationally as well, because there was the President of the United States and his wife walking among these quilts, and they made a statement, and they made a sort of apology for the fact that his predecessors had ignored a lot of this. So I see the quilt as having a huge emotional thing. It is a virtual graveyard, and it brings together that horizontal thing. These people who might have been scattered over the country. So if you say, well, if they were buried in different graveyards as they physically were across America, many of them coming to New York and San Francisco from Wyoming, etc. And same with Ireland. Many gay men, for instance, in Cork. I was exceptional. I came to Dublin when I left. But many gay men said, why would you go to Dublin where you're going to have the same oppression? They went to London. And so some of them were buried abroad in London, in New York, in Australia, in Paris. But wherever the quilt brings them together as the Irish AIDS graveyard, Irish AIDS memorial. So I see it as it's politically significant and important. It's emotionally significant, and it is as a symbol of the memorial to those people. It is very important.
It's Cathal, it's absolutely fascinating to hear that, you know, to hear the impact of what it represented, and how, you know, as you say, that kind of bringing together of those communal you know, that space, that mourning space. And kind of with that in mind, I suppose it's kind of pertinent to ask, you know, what do you feel should potentially happen to the quilts now? And, you know, should they remain in circulation, or should they become a kind of a museum piece, or should they go into storage, or what would be your feelings on that?
It's a very sensitive one because, you know, well, I know people who died. The people who made the quilts themselves obviously are the people who should have the greatest input, because I didn't make a quilt, so I'm speaking from the outside in that sense. Also, memorials are very difficult. I mean, because I think of it as a graveyard, I think of the traditions around a graveyard in Ireland. You know, you have the blessing of the graves once a year, where people will go. It's usually in the middle of the summer. It's nice, fine weather, and people gather, and the priest will say a few words of prayer, and the relatives of a lot of people who are buried in that graveyard will come together. And because it's once a year, it's special. And then on the other hand, you have like, if you take, for instance, we have the memorials to, say, for instance, I think of the big one would be the Vietnam War, you know, or 9/11. So these are permanent memorials that anybody can go to visit. So there are arguments for both. My own personal thing is that I tend to feel that, well, I visit my family graves occasionally, but it's occasionally. I don't go there every day, and I don't think it would be healthy personally if people did. And I think also that the old phrase, I mean, this may be, forgive me now, this may be inappropriate, but I think that the fear that familiarity kind of deadens impact. So for me, my personal sort of suggestion or feeling is that maybe people could consider holding a quilt event once a year. The date I was thinking of is sort of the 1st of December, which is Irish AIDS Day. Also, you could think of special occasions. So, for instance, the quilt, you know, the quilt in America was started in 1986, I think, or 87. So you could say today, this year is the 25th anniversary of the quilt being founded, kind of thing. But like, if there were those kind of 5-yearly or 10-yearly or 20, that it would make it more special and more impactful, and the community could put more of an effort. Whereas if it happens, you know, if you say, well, we could have it as part of Pride, and there are a REACH, which is the religious spiritual group, LGBTQIA group, that they hold religious services as part of Pride. And well, I'm not religious myself. I have gone to them once or twice, and I think that's great as a ceremony, as a religious ceremony. But for the memorial, the monument that is the quilts, I would think of, as I say, maybe having them there, having them on permanent display. As I said, I mean, you can see, well, I went to see them, or I didn't go to see them. I didn't get to see them when they were on display, but I saw the Morning Ireland, the excellent coverage there, which they did, which is great, and I got the impression, and they were hanging up on etc. on display, and I think because they'd not been displayed for so long, they were very powerful. But I have a question mark over whether they should be on display permanently every day for someone just to, maybe they should. You say, well, graveyards, call to use your analogy, are there for anybody to visit anytime they want to. To be honest, I don't have a strong kind of urge for that way. I do know, I think we should mention as well, I do know that in America and in Ireland there are people, and in Britain there are people in the gay community or the LGBTQIA community who are agitating for a permanent physical memorial to those United States. And this would, the argument is that this should be done as reparation by the state, you know, the states in those cases, the governments in those cases, and that it would be something like the formal ones that are done for victims, in inverted commas, or people who suffer as a result of violence against them because of who they are within the state. It's not really an answer, is it? It's more a question.
Well, no, it is. Can I just throw, sorry, this is off script. You know, it's interesting when you talk about them as, you know, that you view them as graves. I mean, what do you think the kind of legacy for a younger generation coming to view them is, and having them, say, exhibited, be it in a temporary exhibition, that the kind of younger generation can come in and learn from them? I mean, do you think there's a value in that?
Certainly. I think a more ambitious thing would be to say that the young could, you know, I said it's a virtual graveyard. You could make it actual virtual. You know, you could transform, each of the quilts could be put up, and what you could do is, you know, crowdsourcing. You could actually ask the people who made the quilts if they're still alive, the relatives of the people who were memorialized in those quilts, the friends, to crowdsource, to come in with the technology. It's there now, you know, with comments, or to record a video and say, we made this quilt. This is how. Here are photographs of Joan or Joe or whatever, and we, you know, this is what their lives were, or here's a home movie of them. So because I say it humanizes and makes clear, because it's so, for young people today, I was struck by something I saw recently, and it was a documentary, and oh no, it wasn't a documentary, sorry, it was actually in Epic. I went to Epic, the Emigration Museum, and they have still hopefully will become integrated into the full exhibition, but they have a temporary exhibition on LGBTQIA diaspora, the Irish LGBTQIA diaspora. It's quite a mouthful, sorry. Diaspora, and they have room for comments at the end, and there are lots of interesting comments. People just handwrite them. The one that I was there last week, and the one that struck me was, said, "I'm a 16-year-old queer, and it's very hard for me to imagine what at all life would have been like before 2000. And I thought, you know, wow, you know, for my, you know, my brothers and sisters, or not, my nieces and nephews, I should say, I'm going to next, I'm now having grandnephews and grandnieces, and I'm just thinking, you know, they're going to live in a totally different world. How do you convey what my world is? You can't, but you can bring it home on a human level, and that's what the quilts were about. They had a political outfit because they were human, and so something around this. Now, again, I'm just throwing things out more than anything else, because I think it will be in a way, it will be questioned. Maybe we should ask better the 16 and 18-year-olds out there and say, you know, these quilts, you know, what would make them meaningful? What do they raise for you? And they might say, well, you know, they look like artworks. And you say, well, they're not really artworks. There's something more privileged than that. There's something more serious. It's not that art isn't serious, but there's something more sensitive than that. And so, you know, maybe dare I coin that terrible phrase, a focus group, that what we need is to actually consult the community, our future, and say, listen, you know, you've seen this, like maybe at the end of the project, the culture night, maybe ask for feedback from young people or other people to ask that question of what do you think, or maybe even have a kind of discussion online with young people who come in, out, etc. could help with, and NXF and LGF, etc. could bring it together, and Culture Ireland could bring a kind of virtual thing. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm really evading, having been certain about things. I'm suddenly saying, because I don't think it's, you know, I do really feel that my age now, I'm 66, and I know it sounds like a cliche, but you do begin to feel, hey, you know, I'm 2 generations removed from these people, you know, and the future is theirs. I mean, I can enjoy what language, how much, and I hope it's going to be a lot, I'm going to see of it, but I've contributed my major bit, you know, and it's for them to say, and I don't have an answer.
But I actually think that's a great answer. I think to look at that and actually bring it back to the younger generation and see how we make this as poignant as it was for you back in the day when you experienced that firsthand, to actually bring the impact and the emotion of that and that connection to the younger generation. I think that's actually a really, really valuable point, actually. And I think that's definitely something we'll have to pursue. We'd love to see that. Yeah. And let them decide what actually connects to the younger generation and how we can use the quilts in that way. And I suppose on that note, just to kind of broaden it, is there anything else? We've talked about various different aspects of the whole time of AIDS hitting Ireland and all of that, and the quilts. But I wonder, is there anything else that you'd like to share from your own experience, either a personal story or some other key
personal story with 2 personal stories that, I mean, that one is slightly amusing, though sad. That was that I mentioned, you know, I had this kind of burnout in 1991, and then went off and lived abroad in the 90s in Amsterdam. But before that, I also had another crisis because you know, there's the problem with AIDS is it brought a lot. It's so personal, but in the sense of it is our lives. And in 1985, when I wasn't at the actual meeting that founded Gay Health Action, I helped to organize it, but it has happened. I had a break in contracts. I was on contract with the IB, so I was in the break in contracts, and so I went off for a holiday in the winter of 1985, January 1985, to Paris. And while I was there, I had unsafe sex. And I can't blame the other guy because he offered the possibility, but I said of safer sex, but I said, no, I want this. So, and then I blanked it like a lot of gay men did. I blanked it out of my mind. So I'm not going to think about that. But 2 years later, I'm now working frenetically on Gay Health Action and AIDS, writing leaflets about testing about it. And I suddenly become, and how long it can take. And I'm sort of thinking back to, did I have kind of flu-like symptoms after that when I came back? Am I positive? Will I think? And I started panicking, started talking about this with a kind of slight panic. And then one of my friends was Tom McGinty, who was the dice man. And we drank together with a group of people in Donacarney, and Drumcondra, and up there and that, and so he took me aside and he said, Cathal, I'm positive. And he told me his story and I told him mine. He said, look, you know, at that stage, we were still dubious about testing, because I said, well, there's no cure. Why would I test if there's no cure? And he said, well, at least you'll know when it can put you out of thing. And I tested, and I actually used the facilities we had. We had set up, Gay Health Action had set up as well, Corda, which was a more help organization, less we were the politics, looking for resources and funding. They were taking care of people, providing buddies, getting their support up. So I talked to the counsellor there, and she was very good, and she said, look, so I decided to test, and luckily I was negative. But then Tom went on to develop full-blown AIDS. I was in Amsterdam in 1994, and I came back on holiday. I came back for a month's holiday, met up with Tom, and AIDS was progressing very much on him at that stage. And he was developing bouts of dementia. So we met up with Aidan and Winnie and Stuart Martin, my friends with him, and we had a lovely night. And then I went on the rest of my holiday, and then he disappeared. And he just turned up in Galway. But by the time they could get to Galway to contact him, he'd gone up to Scotland. And so he returned on the weekend, that on the Monday, the Saturday before the Monday, I was to go home, go back to Amsterdam. So on the Sunday, and this was before mobile phones, etc., that we did have landlines, I was contacted and said, listen, Tom is in St. James's and he'd like to see you. So I went up on the Monday to St. James's, and now I'm thinking, God, I have to get out to the airport, for the flight at 6 o'clock or whatever. So this is like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I go, and of course it's part of the beauty of Ireland that it's so small. The things that the porter there, when I went up to they said he's in block this, go to block. Sort of said, sort of said, like, for confidentiality. He said, well, I can't tell you about anybody who's here, sort of thing, and I don't know what you're doing. And then luckily, I happened to know one of the counsellors who was passing her, and she saw me. She said, oh, Cathal, what are you doing here? I explained. She said, look, okay, leave it with me. And she organised. I went in and saw Tom, and we had a chat, etc., and it was very emotional. And in my mind, I was thinking, this will probably be the last time I see him. So he said, I'll see you out. We walked down the corridor to the door leaving, and we embraced, and I said, goodbye, Tom. And he sort of put his hands on my shoulders and pushed me back a little, looked me in the eye, very disapprovingly and reprovingly. Said, Colin, farewell. I'm not dead yet. And he died the next February. I didn't come back for the funeral. And that was very poignant. I suppose another one that's the last story, the personal story, poignant, is from right back in Cork again. The street where I live, there was my brother is 7 years younger. So his generation, there were a couple of his friends, and one of them came out as gay. I was in Dublin at this stage in the 80s coming back, and he said, oh, did you hear? Pat has come out as gay. And I said, well, that's great. And the facilities, Cork, we now got the centre and all that. He said, yeah, he's going in there now. And then he went to Spain. He finally met a lover and went to Spain. And then the next thing I knew, I was back down in Cork, and they said, Pat has died. And the tragedy then was his family, his father, his mother wanted him brought back for a public burial funeral. His father didn't want him brought back at all, but his aunts, again, you have the strength of women. His aunts insisted. So he's brought back, but he was buried in a private funeral. In other words, there was no notice put on the papers. Nobody knew until it was over. And it was just the family, immediate family. And for me, it affected me personally because I felt like I'm doing all this gay liberation work, all this struggle, and I'm this older generation, and I'm doing it for that generation. And yet, this young man, beautiful young man, dies in his late 20s. And that's my kind of burden. I'm going to tell one last story because, and this is maybe not a good story to tell in a way, but one of the things that, just to show you that, you might say, we talk about solidarity and the need, but we also need responsibility. And it was brought home to me. This was in 1988. And there was a guy, because we were running AIDS, a gay health action, and we were doing safer sex workshops and the whole thing. And there was this guy I was talking to afterwards, and we were just sitting having a cup of coffee on our own. And he said, I'm positive. And I said, wow. And he said, I got it the first time. I said, what? He said, yeah, I was in the closet. I decided to come out. I heard about it to George. I went in, sat at the bar. And this guy to my right said, let me buy you a drink. And I said, no. He said, no, it's buy you a drink. So I let him buy me a drink. And then I was very nervous and scared and young and didn't know anything. And he said, oh, well, now that you've accepted a drink from me, you'll have to sleep with me. And then the guy was intimidated. So he slept with him, ended up becoming positive. And I thought, that is so shocking, made me so angry at abusive behavior within our own. And so I suppose for me, that's another thing that we've got to say, that all the baddies aren't out there outside. Some of them can be inside, and we must fight the bad as well. We must insist on responsibility for each other, and we must name and shame if necessary.
Yeah.
Responsibility that can, and in this case possibly was. I don't know what happened to him afterwards, whether he managed to get retroviral drugs and live, or whether he died, but could be fatal. And that we kill, people can think selfishly and blindly, behave badly. Now that's a very down way to finish anything. So.
Well, it is, but actually I have a question on that, because I know we talked before about this, and you were talking about your concerns partly around the stigma that's within the community currently when people even talk about HIV, even though there's better medication. But also you've talked about how important it is that we educate younger people now, because numbers are on the rise, although it's not terminal as it was before. But just your thoughts on that, just how do we communicate with that younger generation and do all the great things that you were doing with Gay Health Action at the time?
Well, I agree totally, and there are people doing great outreach as much as possible, but it comes back to the central thing. We need to get into everybody's hands. In other words, age-appropriate information in secondary schools.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we give, but nowadays, when people say, oh, well, you want to make sure that it's not inappropriate and it's not pornographic. So, well, of course, but like those worries, it seemed to me, are very minor these days, when we need to block. Most kids at 13, 14 can go online and get access to stuff. And we're censoring them in school and not giving them the information that will save their lives, that will keep them healthy. And this should go to all children, because we don't know who's going to be gay or not. We don't. And I like the idea of the younger generation talking about fluidity. I'm now wearing my hair long again now that I'm retired, etc. I haven't been to the barber for 2 years. But in the early 70s, I grew my hair long as part of the hippie generation thing. And we wanted to break down the rigid stereotyping of masculine and feminine. And we wanted to get away from that and say being male and female was different to being masculine and feminine. Masculine and feminine are traits. Male and female and intersex, etc., are your life, but you can be different kinds of people. And I like the modern idea. So we wanted more fluidity, but we didn't maybe fully do it out the way the younger generation have. And I like that, which means that people may actually change over time as well, which is unsettling to many people, but I think it's fine. And so that means that in the schools and in the thing, we don't know who's gay anymore. We don't know who's going to engage in the sex that transmits gay, that transmits the bodily fluids. So we also need to educate about U equals U, so as to destigmatize HIV stigma. Undetectable equals untransmissible. And that's very important, for my generation, because we were very scared of it, and we did bring up taboos. If somebody showed any sign of being HIV positive, people say, well, don't sleep with them, you don't want to take the risk, etc. And now it's possible. Then the fear will be, oh, even if you wear a condom, maybe it'll split and something will go wrong, or they wear a condom and it'll split. So I think I'm getting off the point. It's very important for younger people today to be given the information, to be encouraged. But that needs to be part of, and I'm greatly enthused to see the INTO primary school team, LGBT group, have actually formulated LGBTQIA plus Irish history lessons. That's a beginning. But when they get on second, they're going to need more information about more concrete stuff. And at the moment, we have a big argument building up because some elements of the Catholic Church are trying to block inclusive RSE, relationships and social skills, etc. And these are public schools. We are funding them. And what we need to do is appeal, like I'm the age of a grandparent now, but we need to appeal to the parents, my nieces and nephews' age, to say, what do you want your children to have? Do you want them to have all the information so they can be healthy and stay safe? Or do you want to risk saying, oh, I'll take care of it myself? But what about the other children in the neighborhood? What about the people they meet? They could be, if they're not. So let's put it into schools. That would be the central one. And then we need to see it visible on television. I mean, we had to fight in the 80s to get some of the things we got from the government were not good enough. Nowadays, we've got all the resources. So let's look and say to the, TG Car, Virgin Air, TV, RTE, etc., and say to them, let's look at appropriate information for young people and in the young person's time. In other words, before the watershed or in the afternoon.
Yeah. I think that's so important, absolutely. And that's got to be the lesson that we all learn from this, I think, and take to it. And I think that's a lovely note to finish on, Cathal, actually. Just to hope for the future that we can actually try and reach these kids and make life better for everyone. Thank you so much, Cathal.
Cathal, thank you so much. It's great to get those insights.
Fascinating and heartbreaking and also inspiring at the same time. Thank you so much, Cathal.
Thank you so much. And Hannah, thank you very much for all the technical help. And